Hi everyone, I'm Josh Bullard. I lead Hydrock's Smart Energy and Sustainability team. Welcome to the first in our series of seminars on net zero. So a quick overview of Hydrock just before we commence. So many of you will be familiar with us already, but just for those that aren't, we're a multidisciplinary engineering and environmental consultancy operating throughout the UK. Our Smart Energy and Sustainability team advises on energy and storage optimisation, decarbonisation, strategies and carbon reporting, as well as utility infrastructure and sustainable master planning. So this presentation focuses on the background and definitions for net zero. We'll then be reviewing the technology and policy interventions required to meet the timeline in our second seminar. Innovation and grant funding as a mechanism to overcome any concerns over commercial viability in the third. And then finally, we'll be looking at the planning system in relation to the built environment and whether there's a gap in terms of the climate emergency declarations versus what's actually achievable. So this is a very big subject area, so we're only really going to be able to touch on some of the high level themes today. But just as a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover, so we'll talk around the context in terms of existing policy and the challenge. Some of the progress that's been undertaken to date, so how is the UK doing in terms of its emissions mitigation? We'll then look at the scope emissions, what is in scope, what is out of scope, and some of the definitions themselves in terms of how is corporate reporting undertaken in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and also what do we do in the built environment and what makes a net zero building. Finally, then just a quick overview of some next steps for the UK and whether we're about to see the start of a green revolution. So just to start off with, in terms of a bit of context, the link between greenhouse gas emissions, global temperature rise and climate change is now well understood. Prior to COVID-19, concern over climate change was at an all-time high, and pressure is now mounting on government to make a green industrial strategy integral to any economic recovery. Just on the legal and policy framework for net zero, well, this originates in 1992 from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was in 1997 then that agreement was made on emissions targets and a baseline for assessment. So for all EU states, this is relative to a 1990 baseline. In the UK, our commitment was enshrined in policy through the Climate Change Act in 2008. So this sought to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. More recently, probably the most important international consideration was the Paris Agreement in 2016. So this uses the latest climate science to demonstrate that we need to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change through limiting global temperature rise to 2 degrees C as a minimum, and where possible 1.5 degrees C. And this is where the crucial tipping point is for the most extreme weather events. It's also under this agreement, Article 2.1c, which I'll just highlight, this requires all financial flows to be consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient developments. Now this is going to become incredibly important in terms of how financial decisions are made going forward in the banking sector. So it's off the back of this agreement, the Paris Agreement, the UK government has now become the first major economy to pass net zero emissions into law. So 100% reduction moving forward, our previous commitment in 2008. And this again is based on seeking to meet that 1.5 degree temperature threshold as a maximum. So you'll note at the bottom there are some regional subtleties in terms of our emissions commitments. So the UK as a whole is targeting 100% offset by 2050. But in Scotland, with its abundance of natural resources for wind power in particular, it has an accelerated target date. Wales, on the other hand, due to its reliance on agriculture, which is somewhat more challenging to tackle, has a reduced target. So overall, they're roughly balancing themselves out. The scale of the challenge, well, we talk about unprecedented a lot in terms of COVID-19 at the moment, and again here it's going to require transformational change to our institutions and consumption habits. So on this point, around 2/3 of emissions reduction will require some form of behaviour change. And while a regulatory framework is in place, the UK is not prepared for the level or rate of change of interventions that are going to be required from this point forward. So at a national level, if we take our graph, our emissions are set every 5 years. So we have 5-yearly carbon budgets. So we're currently in the third of those carbon budgets that were originally set in 2008. And the sixth is going to be updated to account for the revised net zero emissions target in 2050. So the emissions covered as part of this at a national level are what's called territorial. So they are production emissions from any activities that occur within the UK. And this is regardless of where the business is registered. So to, I suppose, flip that and say, well, what isn't included? The key points here are international aviation and shipping, any UK residents that might be abroad, and probably the final and most important is production of any goods and services that the UK imports. So these are what we refer to as consumption emissions. So in terms of our overall offset, if we look at the moment, we're around 450 megatons that we need to offset in terms of the scope that is included, so the production-based emissions. If we were to include those additional emissions that we talked about, so the international aviation, the UK residents living abroad, and production of goods and services, the consumption emissions, this target would be about 30% higher, so quite a considerable uplift. So in terms of true zero, you can see here we would actually need to offset additional emissions beyond that. So thus far we have made substantial progress, but what we've taken can be considered probably the low-hanging fruit or easy wins. And it's here really we've got the next 10 years that are going to be crucial to meet the 2050 date. So the rate of carbon reduction needed from this point is around 30% higher year on year to what's been achieved to date. So now that foundations are in place, we talked around where do those emissions originate from. We can now look at a bit of progress in each sector. So it's a mixed picture. Power in particular has shown a significant reduction. So a large-scale rollout of renewables, so grid-scale wind and solar in particular. We now have the largest offshore wind capability, and this should be considered a success. So the national grid itself plans to be able to operate solely from renewables in 2025. It's possible with the right policy interventions, we could also be world leaders in other technologies such as carbon capture and storage, or even the hydrogen economy. But across all other sectors, there's a significant amount of work to be done here. So just running through some of those, if we take transport, we would expect here rapid electrification of EVs to help accelerate this transition. And uptake here has been significantly better than government predictions. So in fact, just last week, government published consultation on bringing forward the petrol and diesel ban to 2035, or ideally earlier if feasible. Moving on to the other factors in terms of those emission data sets, it's existing building stock that has a large impact here. So around 40% of our overall emissions, which is a significant issue, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So this is primarily around how we phase out gas consumption, so either through electrification or the hydrogen economy. But the latter of those is unlikely to be off the ground until the 2030s. So we need to act now to improve this. So it's important here just to flag that there is no single pathway to net zero. We have choices in every sector. What we need is clarity on policy and decision making to accelerate uptake and provide the market confidence which we've seen happen in the power sector. So the final point out here is that the Committee on Climate Change has stated that the UK to date has only delivered around 1 of 25 critical policies needed to get emissions on track, and that was in relation to wind offshore pricing. So can we seize the opportunity? Again, on COVID-19, the global pandemic has really helped bring into focus what is possible if we act in response to an emergency. We've not used coal power generation for over a month, whereas as recent as 5 years ago, it was providing around 40% of our electrical demand. Emissions on the roads are down by 70%, and it's demonstrated that less traffic can quickly lead to cleaner air. So the question here is, can we afford to go back to business as usual? On the subject of urgency, we can turn to the UK's local authorities. Now, as of today, around 274 have declared a climate emergency. So while responsible for about 2% of the national emissions, local authorities have the potential to influence around 3/4. So if we take one example in Bristol, which was the first to declare a climate emergency, Alongside effectively banning fossil fuels for heating and transport, it's now committed to a low carbon heat network covering the majority of the city, a near zero waste stream, and reduction in private car use back in line with levels at a national level in line with roughly the 1980s. So now the majority of other authorities are following suit and are at various stages of developing their evidence bases and mitigation strategies. And in terms of those commitments, primarily councils are looking to their own activities in terms of that commitment, so carbon neutral by 2030, but where possible and where viable, then seeking to offset the remainder across their wider authority boundary. So it's going to be interesting to see how the energy strategies emerge over the next few years. Moving on to how do we actually measure carbon, so in terms of the scope emissions. Well, at a national level, our emissions are grouped by what we call industrial categories. So these are reported through the ONS as data sets, which can be reviewed by sector or by location. So this helps us to inform the basis for local authority carbon inventories and the energy sustainability strategies that are then picked up by the wider local enterprise partnerships. At a corporate level, the greenhouse gas protocol scope emissions are of relevance here, and this is what most companies will need to adhere to. So these are split into 3 scopes. So scope 1 is direct burning of fossil fuels, so anything in buildings or vehicles. Scope 2 is then indirect emissions resulting from purchased energy. So this is effectively grid-derived electricity. Everything else is then within scope 3. So all other indirect emissions, whether they be upstream activities or downstream resulting from the supply chain. And it's these scope 3 items that are going to be by far the most challenging and where we need to start thinking about international considerations. So whether that be physical or geographical boundaries come into play. So we talked a bit earlier about the ability of individuals to influence emissions through behaviour, and this is really important, but the vast majority of emissions will need to be through government and industry action. So to meet net zero by 2050, taking all of this on board, we need to reduce all of these emissions to as close to zero as possible, with only the remainder then being offset. So the UK position is for any offsetting of our production-based emissions to be carried out where possible onshore. So on those last resorts, if we call them, in terms of the offsetting and carbon sinks. So again, looking at the national picture, there's 2 forms of carbon sinks that are relevant here. So we've got natural sinks. So the most obvious one is reforestation, for example, so removing and storing carbon through abatement or sequestration. And then artificial, so this is negative emission technologies such as carbon capture and storage. Now on CCS, carbon capture and storage, no trials have actually been undertaken to date in the UK. There's around 40 around the world, but really it's essential that we move forward on this and that a pilot is actually undertaken into the 2030s, because we're not going to get to 2050 net zero without this in some form. So they will be required to offset the more challenging emission groups, so notably here, aviation sector and agriculture. Now, if we drill down from the national down to an authority or building level, offset measures can be more readily utilised. So to give an example here, if we took an existing building that may have exhausted its opportunities in terms of retrofitting fabric or energy efficiency improvements, and let's say there's limited space at roof level for solar photovoltaics, for renewable power, what you could look to do then is fund off-site renewable projects through a payment mechanism, so an offset in lieu payment. Now this process is already in place across a number of authorities, such as the GLA in London and a lot of the municipal centres. Okay, so that covers a bit in terms of the scope emissions. We're now going to have a look at 2 forms of definitions in terms of net zero, which captures corporate accounting first, and then we'll talk around buildings as well. So starting with corporate accounting, well, there isn't actually a common agreed definition yet for net zero, but there is one that is emerging. So the Science Based Targets initiative, led by the Climate Disclosure Project, is calling on private companies to align their greenhouse emissions target with the 1.5 degree scenario that we talked about earlier in the Paris Agreement, under what they're calling a science-based approach to climate neutrality. So under this approach, a working definition has been developed, and this is worth reading. So I'll just read through this. So achieving a state in which the activities within the value chain of a company result in no net impact on the climate from greenhouse gas emissions. This is achieved by reducing value chain greenhouse gas emissions in line with 1.5 degree pathways and by balancing the impact of any remaining greenhouse gas emissions with an appropriate level of carbon removals. And it's this final bit that's quite crucial, and this is where we can differentiate between carbon neutral and net zero as this new terminology. So carbon neutral is already defined under PAS 2060 standard. So this isn't actually a British standard yet, but it's likely to become one relatively soon. So under carbon reduction plans, it doesn't actually require a specific level of ambition, nor restrict how companies can offset their emissions. So on this, companies can either self-certify or seek third-party verification. So we've been asked by a number of organisations to adopt these principles. Net zero, on the other hand, in terms of the new methodology and the preferred route, is more prescriptive. So it requires that alignment with the 1.5 degree science-based target. And the emphasis here is all around timescales and feasibility of actually meeting that net zero date. So it needs to be demonstrable, there needs to be a plan in place, and it can't all be left till the end date. So again here, it only allows a certain form of offsetting in certain situations. So there's still some work to be done here in terms of how that definition will be agreed, and in particular, how it's looked at national level and in the international sphere as well. So if we talk around the ratio of reductions to removals, so how much can we reduce first before we then look at offsets? Well, emissions need to be reduced to the greatest possible extent before any residual emissions can be offset. So this has always been a key part of responsible offsetting. But there are some challenges here about, again, what's in scope and out of scope. So on the physical boundaries, while it might make sense for a country to generate offsets within its own borders, as the UK is attempting to do, it could be impractical to expect the vast majority of companies to effect offsetting within their own value chains. So instead, it's anticipated here that companies will be able to purchase offset certificates in the future. So this would be the same way that companies currently purchase renewable energy certificates or guarantees of origin, for example, on electricity. On accounting boundaries, well, here we're looking to essentially treat scope 1 and 2 emissions locally and then look to an international approved offset certificate scheme for scope 3. Just the final bit here, that there is also now a new requirement this year, a mandatory requirement for streamlined energy and carbon reporting. So this provides a framework for assessment around 12,000 companies. So at the moment, that is only looking at scope 1 and 2, and it's taking the carbon neutral methodology. So we would expect that to be uplifted in due course where companies are looking to be more ambitious. So finally, on this point, I just want to pull up the Carbon Trust definition of net zero and what should be taken forward from here. So a net zero company will set and pursue an ambitious 1.5 degree aligned science-based target for its full value chain emissions. So on full value chain here, they would be talking about scope 1, 2 and 3. So any remaining hard to decarbonise emissions can be compensated using certified greenhouse gas removal. So that is the offset scheme we talked about. Okay, so that's corporate emissions and corporate accounting. We're just going to touch on building design now as well. So this is, again, a huge subject area, and we could probably cover a separate seminar looking specifically at this. So I'm just going to go through some of the principles in terms of the net zero terminology and framework. And again, just setting the scene, we know 100% of buildings need to be net zero by 2050. So in order to limit any burden from new development, it's essential that all new buildings adopt zero carbon guidelines as early as possible. So again, if we look at the authority positions in planning, a number have already brought forward these guidelines, but in practical terms, 2030 is seen as the latest possible date where this has to be achieved. So from that point, any new development must be zero carbon. So in terms of existing buildings, 80% of the stock will still be in place in 2050. So if we think about this for a minute and take into account the refurbishment cycles, we essentially have 2 opportunities to get this right. Refurbishment cycles may be in a period of sort of 15, 20 years, so only 2 opportunities. So on power, if we think about, well, how can we achieve this? Power, we know the grid is being rapidly decarbonised. Therefore, the main challenge, again here, is around heat, in particular for existing buildings, and how we get off gas. So just a few points here. Taking low carbon heat networks to start with. So there are around 200 heat network projects going through either feasibility, design or construction stages that are being part funded through the Heat Networks Investment Programme through government. So for these systems and indeed remote buildings where heat connection is not going to work in terms of district heating, heat pumps are likely to be the most viable source, certainly for the next 10 to 15 years. We take current heating demand in peak winter, it's probably around 5 times the current capacity on the grid. So it's really important that technologies with high thermal efficiencies, such as heat pumps, are utilised. The government here has just published some guidance consultation on capital grants to support that in a domestic application. Moving on to hydrogen again, and hybrid systems. So these could be utilised, and it's certainly part of the picture. So the gas network at the moment is going through a repurposing in terms of its design and replacement on materials from steel to plastic. So either through a gas blend in the interim, so up to 20% of hydrogen blended into the gas networks, or a fully hydrogen prime network once the grid can support this. But this is not going to be feasible until 2030s at the earliest. So it's really important that we make decisions now, act on buildings, and we can't just wait for this to occur into the 2030s. So finally, on energy efficiency and fabric retrofit, to date here, uplift has been relatively low, mainly due to the capex gap and funding in terms of support. So really here we need stricter regulation and incentives to support that transition. So I mentioned we could focus on this as an entire seminar, but I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of an emerging framework that's been published by the UK Green Building Council. So this has identified 3 scopes for building projects, and just important to say these are different scopes to the 3 that we talked about before in terms of those emissions data sets. So for buildings, in terms of net zero, construction, so this would be the embodied carbon content of the materials being used. On operational energy, the one that we're most familiar with, so this is emissions resulting from operation. So this would follow the principles of the energy hierarchy in good design. So firstly, reduce energy demand through fabric measures, then reduce energy consumption through provision of efficient services, supply renewable energy where feasible and practical on the site, before finally then offsetting any residual emissions off-site. So again here, this final point requires a suitable recognised scheme. And taking both of those together would then give the whole life net zero definition for buildings. So that final one is still underway. So just touching on both of those, operational carbon. So this is the area that's currently covered under building regulations. Everything else is not currently regulated. So under approved document Part L of the building regulations, conservation, fuel and power, this covers what we call regulated loads. So these are any associated with building services and fixed equipment. There's the list there. So heating, ventilation, in particular, air conditioning. On the latter, on unregulated loads, so this is all of our plugins or specific equipment. None of this is mandated at the moment in terms of regulations. So these are all voluntary in terms of reducing carbon. However, there are building environmental assessment methods such as BREEAM or Passive House that seek to address this. On embodied carbon, so this covers the building's life cycle emissions. So from cradle to cradle, from raw material extraction at the beginning, through the transport manufacture to sites, the construction activities themselves, through the operational stages, which includes that operational energy definition that we mentioned. And then finally, maintenance, replacement, eventual deconstruction, demolition, and where needed, disposal. So a whole life net zero assessment would need to consider all of these aspects for the building project. So are we about to see a green revolution? What is the next steps for us as the UK, and can the UK be a leader to take us forward? So at a political level, there is already an all-party consensus for delivering net zero. There are a few other countries which have the political will the framework in the form of the carbon budgets and the Climate Change Act, and scrutiny via the Committee on Climate Change, which wield that much power. So net zero is a binding legal target for us to 2050, and this will force action. At a regulatory level, we're already seeing policy decisions to help facilitate this. The Paris Agreement will further enforce this through financial decisions. And again, I'll just reiterate that point on that article, that decisions need to be made that are consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilience. We're seeing investee decision making is already having an impact here. So pension funds are now required to ask us, what do we want to invest in? And a significant portion are choosing sustainable funds. Further, the early indicators through COVID are that businesses that adopt sustainable practices are leading the way. So reputation here is going to have an important part to play for businesses. Net zero pledges that we're already seeing on many companies are seeking to help to drive competition within those sectors. And it's crucial here that the potential for upside or reputational damage could be significant if there are reporting irregularities. So finally, just to put things into context here, the latest predictions are that we need to invest around 1 to 2% of GDP to meet net zero. So alongside a better quality of life and reduced risk of climate change, low carbon investment can really help to answer the COVID recovery in the short term, but also the long term, the growing desire to build a more resilient economy and a society that can help address public health concerns. So what does net zero in 2050 look like for the UK? Well, whichever pathway the UK takes, it's clear that innovation, investment and incentives across the low carbon technologies, how we use land and resources, and our lifestyle choices are all going to be essential to achieve net zero. Our next seminar will look at this in a bit more detail. Thanks very much. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to some Q&A now. So I'm just going to look through and see what we've got here. So feel free to keep adding in while we're chatting. So, okay, here's a question. So if a service company, e.g. a consulting company that provides design for clients, wants to be net zero, what would you say their full value chain is? Where do they draw the line between what to count as theirs and what is for the client? Yeah, so there's, unfortunately on this one, there's not a straightforward answer to this one. So on those value chains, we talked around the three scopes. So scope 1 and 2 being the straightforward ones, so that is our direct burning fossil fuels, and then the grid derived electricity, so anything that you're using on site. On scope 3, that is everything downstream or upstream in terms of supply chains. So in terms of what a company should be including, essentially it's anything that's going to be within the territory of the UK. So there would need to be a boundary drawn between companies in terms of what's acceptable. Ultimately, companies need to ensure their whole supply chain is adhering to that same policy. So this framework is still underway at the moment, and I would expect over the next 6 months to a year that will become more apparent in terms of where those boundaries are defined. So again, at the moment, that the SECRA guidelines that we talked about, that's the streamlined energy and carbon reporting, that does only cover scope 1 and 2. But that will be adjusted to take into account scope 3. So we've been waiting for an update to Part L, so that was approved document of the building regulations in terms of conservation of fuel and power for around 4 years. When are you expecting net zero for new buildings to become regulation, and to what degree and scope? Yes, so on this point, there was already a framework in place for net zero buildings. So in fact, it should have been 2016 for domestic buildings and 2019 for non-domestic buildings. So it's disappointing that we're so far behind in terms of reduction in emissions. But what at the moment has been published is the Future Homes consultation. So that is due for adoption in 2025. And it had two versions. There was a more ambitious and a less ambitious option in terms of how much emissions would be reduced. So almost overwhelmingly, the feedback has been that the more ambitious criteria should be chosen. So that is a 31% reduction in carbon emissions, but quite rightly, as highlighted by the person who put the question forward, that is not going to get us to net zero yet. So we need to be pushing that forward. So I think really who's leading the way here is the local authorities. So London, in the London plan in particular, is already taking on board net zero in terms of at least operational emissions. Just to be clear, not net zero across all of those value streams, but on operational emissions, on energy in particular, that's already been adopted. So we are seeing that across a number of other authorities as well. So they are leading the way. Unfortunately, it's not being led from central, from government. There is also on the emerging guidelines through the Future Home Standard a risk that there'll be a block on local authorities being able to actually take more ambitious requirements forward. So that's something that we need to be watching closely. But again, if we go back to what I was saying in terms of what's realistic to get us to 2030, we know that 2030 is the final point where all new development needs to be net zero. So we've got around 10 years to act and get to that point. So bearing in mind, we thought we were going to be there in 2016. There's no excuse really to not be doing it from today. Okay, so question here, what do you believe the role is of nuclear energy to support net zero? So I think this is a really good question, and I think nuclear energy definitely does have a part to play. I think one of the challenges we have at the moment is that a lot of our baseload on our power supply is provided by nuclear, circa I think 25% or more at the moment. So a lot of our power stations are going through a decommissioning process. So in the next 10 years, those will be rapidly coming offline. So even with Hinkley Point C that is coming online, there's going to be a shortfall there. So actually, I think it's imperative that we do look at nuclear as an option. And actually, BEIS, in terms of the government organisation, is looking at the role of small modular reactors as a means to potentially utilise low carbon nuclear energy on a local level. So again, there's no designs in place in the UK yet. Most of it is in Canada, I believe, and I'd have to refer to my nuclear colleagues for more information on that. But yes, I do think it will have a part to play in particular because of the ability to provide a bit of a base load, although that's becoming less of a concern as the grid is able to balance itself now. So we do have more storage on the grid. Battery technology is helping to support that, and the demand side response, so a smarter grid, will help to balance all those technologies. I'll just publish this one as well, and I'm not going to answer it here, but are there any, so the question is, are there any commercial opportunities from our net zero transition? So the answer is an overwhelming yes, and I think I will probably refer that to one of our next seminars, but absolutely there are revenue streams available through embedded energy generation or storage, and a whole raft of opportunities in terms of incentives, grant funds and otherwise to really help facilitate and drive projects forward, both in terms of getting them off the ground, but also in terms of the commercials of the operational side. So actually using an energy asset on your site to generate additional income for the project. Yeah, so a couple more questions about grants. So again, I think I'll suggest our third seminar, which is next week, is looking at this specifically. A couple of questions on the Climate Change Act and the Committee for Climate Change. So question here, given that the UK government has acted only one of the 25 key policy recommendations made by the Committee on Climate Change to keep on track, how confident are you that government will deliver on 2050 net zero, and what will this mean for the level of action by businesses? Yes, so I think here it's probably worth going back to what has been a success story. So the power sector in particular. So how's that been driven? Well, partly through regulation, but also partly through industry action in terms of basically looking ahead and realising that we need to act now. If we don't do this, it's only going to cause problems down the line. So I think of those policies, yeah, I would be minded to say that at the moment the government's probably preoccupied on other concerns. Climate change hasn't been one of its priorities necessarily to date, but the pressure is becoming overwhelming now in terms of, again, that green industrial strategy becoming integral to any response to economic recovery. All the evidence suggests that green measures are economically the best way forward in terms of helping growth, creating a low carbon economy. So I think there is a big risk, but I think what we do have, again, is that scrutiny to make sure that the Committee on Climate Change is reviewing this on a regular basis. So they release a report on a yearly basis to achieve this. I think thus far it's almost been easy because we've been on track with these carbon budgets. So on a 5-year process, essentially because we got rid of coal, we divested from that as a power source. And secondly, because demand was somewhat suppressed through the last financial crisis, that has actually helped us. Now, I would not be surprised again to see that this time, demand has been reduced, our economic output, so that is going to lower our carbon emissions. So probably the risk then is that we'll then be pushing or kicking the can down the road a bit further. So we need to be really applying the pressure. And I think the pressure is becoming more and more relevant and overwhelming for governments. So I would like to hope those policies will be enacted. Okay, well, I think we'll probably leave it there. So again, just want to thank everyone for attending. I hope that's been useful. And again, a huge subject area. So there's a lot more questions that I'll probably try and tackle separately in response to. If anyone's left their name, we'll get in touch and speak again. But yeah, until the next one, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you for the roadmap, which is on Thursday. Thanks.